Today's talk is a Civil War-based talk. You may be asking, why are we doing Civil War talk on a Revolutionary War battlefield? And could somebody grab and shut the door so Molly doesn't get off the back door? Thank you. The reason is that on the grounds of what is now the present Monmouth Battlefield State Park, thank you for closing the door so Molly doesn't get loose. The park was established in 1978. We're darn lucky this is not a mall. In that there were plans to build one here, and the state stepped in and condemned the land and turned this into a state park in the 1970s, and the mall makers went a couple miles up the road, and that's why we have Freehold Raceway Mall, and you're not sitting in a mall parking lot right now. And on the grounds of the land that they purchased, there was a Civil War training camp named Camp Vredenburg, which will be the focus of my talk today. And we'll give more of the history of that in a moment. So that's why there's Civil War talks going on here, because this is a multicultural park. We do have Native American, I think they call it indigenous peoples now, remains. This was on the route that the Lenni Lenape Indians used between their winter, spring, and fall campsites. They go to the shore, I think, to get the fishes. And anyway, so we do have Native American remains here. There's some cases interpreting them in the museum. We have colonial farming, so there are different layers. Obviously the Revolution, we have a Civil War training camp, and we have Victorian era farming. So there's 5 different cultural layers here, and it is a multi-use park. We have scout groups, school groups, hikers, tree huggers. Everybody comes through and enjoys the park, which is great. So the talk today again is Civil War based. And to be honest, I'm not aware of what my topic is for next month. I'll have to look on the calendar, pick up a copy of our newsletter over at the gift shop, or look at our website, friendsofmonmouth.org, and to see what next monthly talk is. I'm embarrassed, I'm not aware of it. I'll look myself. But today we're doing Camp Vredenburg and the Civil War. As I mentioned, there was a training camp here. Civil War is 1861 to 65. The date of the battle is June 28, 1778, so we're talking a couple generations later. In the first year of the war, both sides thought the war would end very quickly. It didn't, and it lasted even longer because the northern troops lost first Bull Run in July of 1861. In order to get more recruits out in 1862, the government of New Jersey decided to have local training camps. And they would get better enlistments if the units were local. Latecomers, there's some handouts there at the top of the stairs if you want to grab one. And the training camp for central New Jersey was here outside of Freehold. It's an ideal location. It's located on a railroad line that can get them to where they wanted to go, and the troops, when they left, would go down the railroad to Trenton and either take the train into Philly and then take a boat down to Washington. But it's also far enough from the town, almost 2 miles, that you don't get too much involved with the liquor stores and the bawdy houses and the other enticements for soldiers there. They could lock the camp down pretty quick. So in the summer of 1862, there's a Civil War training camp here. It's one of 12 camps that New Jersey used during the war, and it's maybe the best preserved one because it was outside of the town. It wasn't built over by a mall like Camp Fair Oaks in Flemington was. It wasn't built over by housing developments like Camp Holden and Trenton. It was just farmland, and was acquired by the park in the 1970s, so it's pretty much preserved. Now, my connection with this is interesting in that in the 1980s, I got a grant from the state to research the site of the camp, and the results of my research are published in this booklet that's in the gift shop. There was a tradition that it was rented, that it was leased from a certain local farmer named Jacob Herbert. And I looked through the state archives, especially the treasurer's reports, to try and get a copy of the lease, either the original or copy. It's not there, but his name was well known. And in doing the research, I stumbled across a map of the railroad, when they put the railroad through. And what's interesting is this railroad map showed all the property owners in 1852. 522 with the Freehold and Jamesburg Agricultural Railroad. It's in the booklet, not the handout. And what's interesting is a lot of those property lots from 1852 are still there today because the farmers owned them or acquired them. And what I thought was interesting is that Mr. Herbert owned a plot on the main road, but had on the other side of the road, back towards the street, what the farmers called a wood lot, which was used to get wood. And what he did was to lease his wood lot to the government because he wasn't really using it. And I know how much you get paid, I just don't have the lease. The site of that, if you're familiar with Route 522, is behind the Cobb House, which is the later parsonage for the preacher at Old Tennant Church. So I did get a copy of a map from 1904 that they had over at Old Tennant Church, confirming again where Jacob Herbert was. So I had two pieces of evidence on what was happening, and based on that I did more research and pretty much defined what the area of this camp is, and I draw maps of it and what I think it is in the booklet. Pretty interesting that we have here an original Civil War training camp. The Archaeology Club did go in and do some excavating. What they found is in one of the display cases, soldier equipment, a few bullets. Interestingly, the troops did not do target practice. If they did, we'd have bullets to find. What we have is drops that they would drop when they're practice loading their guns. The government was so stingy they did not allow them to practice firing their guns. As a matter of fact, the 13th New Jersey Regiment, which was raised up in Woodbridge, went into the Battle of Antietam like 2 days after they got into the Army, and they had never fired their guns in action before. And they were heavily engaged in the Battle of Antietam, the war's bloodiest battle, in September of 1862. So, but they did find some Civil War equipment and pretty much verified my conjecture of the training camp, and we put a historical marker up over there, and that's my special attachment to this camp, because I pretty much confirmed where it is. 3 regiments were raised there. Each Union regiment had around 1,000 men to it. They were different kind of regiments. The main one that I'll be talking about is the 14th Regiment of Infantry. New Jersey had 40 regiments altogether, including 3 of cavalry. The 14th Regiment was enlisted in the summer of 1862 here for 3 years of service. The original troops that went in 1861 would go in for 30 days or 90 days, and you barely got you trained and down to Washington before it was time to go home. So they enlisted here for 3 years of service, and the troops all come from central New Jersey. And my other connection with the 14th is in my reenactor days when I was younger and more energetic, I was in Company F of the 14th New Jersey recreated and did several battles, including ones the 14th fought at as a reenactor. And I always tell people I learned more in one weekend of reenacting when you have to eat and carry, eat what you can carry, wear what you can wear and not change it. You learn more about what the war was like being a reenactor for a weekend than all the books I ever read. So I have another connection with the 14th. So they're here getting minimal bounties. Now, bounty is a bonus they give you for enlisting. You get so much money when you enlist, and then if you die, it goes to your next relative, or if you make it out, they will give you the rest when you're done. They decided later in 1862 to enlist troops for 9 months of service because the 3-year service enlistees weren't really piling up too fast. Okay, the 9-month soldiers, they reached 11 regiments of it. 2 of those regiments were also trained here at Camp Vredenburg, the 28th and 29th. They got higher bounties and were getting less term of service than the guys in the 14th. There were a few fights between these regiments. Just to alert you to that, and I'll talk to you about their careers in a moment. By the way, the name of the camp, Vredenburg, is named after a local judge, Peter Vredenburg Sr. The original major of the unit, the 14th, is Peter Vredenburg Jr., whose picture appears on both of the handouts. And we'll be talking more about him as I go through the regimental history. By the way, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Vredenburg or Vredenburg. I met Peter Vredenburg, the 6th or whatever he was, gave me an autographed picture of the major who will be killed in action in the battle, which I cherish at home in my den. I asked him, how do you pronounce the name Vredenburg or Vredenburg? He said, not real sure, it depends on the branch of the family. And I asked him, how do you spell it? Does it have an H on the end or not? He said, I don't know, it depends on what branch of the family it is. So that's their issue. I pronounce it Vredenburg with no H. So there are 3 regiments here. We have only one picture of the camp. It's in the collection of the Monmouth County Historical Society of the camps that the soldiers stayed in. They actually built like a big barracks. The officers got to stay in tents. Again, that's in the book, not in the handout. Unless, is it on the handout or what? No. We have one picture of it, which is pretty much identified as the camp. The handout that's in black and white will have on the back a plan of the camp. It will be on the south side of Freehold, Englishtown Road, which is Route 522. And the cob house and barn dated to 1871, so they're going around then. The railroad is about 200 yards south of Route 522, and it backs up to Spotswood Middle Brook. And the letters there, I'm sorry, the key's not there. A is the little train station that they built there, still needs excavating. C is the camp of the 14th. Oh, there, it is labeled up top. Okay. D is the parade ground, and G is where the 28th and 29th regiments were. I posited where the cookhouses and the sinks or the bathroom areas all were, and it's still waiting for excavation, but we have nothing else going on over there. I once had the dream of letting Civil War troops actually camp there and spend the night, but then we decided that no, they would contaminate the site. We would have to put down a mesh and whatever, so we're leaving that as pure land, waiting for some generation when we get some money to go and excavate it. Our main concern now is preserving the lands that we have, and I'll add a couple things that the Friends of the Battlefield has acquired land for the park, especially what we call Belterre, or the area between Park and Route 9, if you know where the auto dealers are. We bought that up to preserve it. The actual battle itself covered about 5,000 acres. The park only owns 2,000 because the battle happened in town also, and obviously the town got top of it. So we preserved as much as we can between here and the town. We have fought to retain the integrity of the battlefield. When they built the grand housing development to our west, we had negotiations with them on where they could build houses next to the park, so they didn't interfere with what we call view shed. A few years back, I was witness to a hearing on, they wanted to build a cell tower over by Craig House at the corner of Sugar and off Route 9. We don't need no cell tower overwhelming our battlefield. We have what is said to be one of the best preserved 1700 battlefields in the world. Accidentally, because we're here in the farmlands just outside of Freehold and known as Monmouth Courthouse. The current fight is with warehouses, and let me just update you on that. There was a warehouse plan a year ago across the street from the entrance to the park, which would have been horrendous for traffic and also just view shed and everything else. I gave testimony there, and we pretty much blocked it, and the state is in the process of acquiring that land to add it to the park. There's another warehouse wants to be built just to the west of that. I was at the hearing on Thursday and gave testimony there that we don't need no 50-foot high, 5-story high warehouse right across the street from the park. And the main issue I had with them is the validity of their traffic study. They did a traffic study in April, which is the minimal time. If you live around here, as I trust many of you do, there's apple and pumpkin picking time. There's mall traffic. There's going to the beach traffic. April's probably the minimal year. Anyway, there's some major issues with this that we're fighting right now to retain the integrity of the park area. So anyway, enough politicizing. So we're glad that the Civil War training camp is there, and I found out where it was, and someday we'll get around to researching it. So I mentioned that there are 3 different Civil War regiments trained there, the 14th, the 28th, and the 29th. I'll talk most of the time about the 14th, it being my favorite regiment, and it just served longer. The history of the 14th Regiment is told in a book called The Monocacy Regiment, which I wrote back in, I don't remember when. Where's the copy of this? 84, I think it was. Anyway, 87. It's out of print and hard to find, but the local libraries have copies. And again, so that's not available, but the Camp Vredenburg booklet is, which is actually a chapter pulled out of that book. The 14th New Jersey mustered in on August the 26th of 1862 and headed down to Washington. They did not go immediately into action. They spent some time in the Washington defenses and then went to a town called Frederick, Maryland, which may not be familiar to you, but it's in western Maryland, about 45 minutes south of Gettysburg, very nice, big western oil for the Union town. And what their job there was to guard a bridge. And there was a bridge over what they call Monocacy River. That's how you pronounce it. And by the way, I named my book the Monocacy Regiment, and I'm pleased to see that that's what the nickname of the unit now is, the Monocacy Regiment, because they spent their first year there guarding the bridge. They were there, I guess, again, most of the year, and they made friends with the locals pretty much, even dated the girls there, went to the church there, and they had no battle casualties, but around 40 of their members died while they're there guarding the bridge. And I won't read the names for you, but these are some of the causes of death of members of the 14th New Jersey while they were guarding a bridge over the Monocacy River. Drowned in the river, fever, pneumonia, typhoid fever, pneumonia, measles, abscess of the lung, typhoid fever, measles, accident on the railroad, typhoid fever, diarrhea, measles, pneumonia, consumption, typhoid fever, measles, and pneumonia. They're camping out. Okay, and when one guy gets sick, unfortunately, the rest of the guys in your tent are probably going to get sick. And they had a fair amount of casualties. I'm not going to say doing nothing, you got to respect them. They're in the Army. The average unit only fought in 1.5 battles a year. So they're suffering from all these diseases. And what's odd is that the troops that survived the illnesses and marched all the time, because everywhere they went, they marched, except when they went down to the war, when they got to take the train and the boat. The healthy ones lined up and shot at each other. And then you're going to end up in a hospital if you get shot, and we'll talk about a guy in the 28th who didn't survive the hospital. So being a soldier was a lot more than just the few minutes or hours, not to denigrate, they spent fighting in big battles. So the 14th Regiment spent its first year on garrison duty at a blockhouse, and we have a picture of it in my book, there on the Monocacy River, and we'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about their monument. After, they were not at Gettysburg. They were still down in Maryland guarding the railroad. Because of the heavy losses at Gettysburg in July of 1863, the regiment was called into action and joined the Army of the Potomac, which is the main unit in the Eastern Theater. Their first firing was not until a battle called, or a skirmish, Locust Grove down in Virginia that fall, when they first finally got into action a year after they enlisted. Their turn came in 1864, when the battles were back and forth across Virginia, and the 14th New Jersey was in the thick of them. In a place called Cold Harbor in the Shenandoah Valley. I went to where they fought at Cold Harbor outside of Richmond, where Grant made an attack, which was kind of like Pickett's Charge in reverse. You're familiar with the term Pickett's Charge. Lots of troops lost in an hour's worth of time. Grant said it was his worst mistake of the war, and the 14th New Jersey was in the middle of that. And that's the only battlefield I've been at where I got the willies. Walking through this area where the 14th New Jersey and Grant's Army lost so many men. I have not been back there. sorry, not going back. So the 14th saw its first action, again, in the fall of 63 at Locust Grove. In 1864, later in the middle of the year, the Confederates decided to invade the North again. Now, you've heard certainly of Gettysburg, which is their invasion in 1863, which got turned back. Antietam, known in the South as Sharpsburg, which was in 1862, and they got turned back. There was another invasion of the North in 1864 that you don't hear much about. General Jubal Early took his command and got within sight of Washington eventually. I'll reverse the order here, but when he got in sight of Washington at Fort Stevens on the northwest corner, they had skirmishers out, and they saw a tall figure with a stovepipe hat looking over the battlements to see what was going on. Abe Lincoln. And they took a shot at him. And the captain next door said, "Sir, I think you should sit down. They have your range." That captain was Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., the writer, the lawyer. Lincoln is one of only 2 American presidents to be actually under fire in a battle. And I can challenge you or some of your history buffs if you know who the other one is. Unless you've heard my lectures before, Todd, do you know her?
Teddy Roosevelt?
No. Oh, he was in action before he was president. Good. I'll stand correction on that. Okay. He was under fire. Well, a lot of them were Grant and Garfield who got shot. Okay, that were under action. I qualify that while they were president. Okay, James Madison at the Battle of Bladensburg in 1814, before the British captured Washington and burned it to the ground. He kind of went out to see what was going on and left in a hurry. We'll leave it at that. So 2 American presidents have been under fire as president. And that attack got defeated. Now, how did that attack get defeated? Because Early's army in his advance out of Virginia had to cross the Monocacy River at Frederick. And we had there some troops that had been brought in basically by railroad, Ohio militia. How much do you think Ohio militia is going to fight to defend a town in Maryland? So they had also sent up a division of the 6th Army Corps, which included the 14th, and they probably sent that division because of the 14th New Jersey. Why? The 14th New Jersey had spent a year there. They knew the land. So the 14th New Jersey is up here at the Battle of Monocacy. And there's some handout here of how that battle went. You see the side of which map it's on. It's the black and white one. No, that's not even here. 3rd Winchester, maybe I don't have a map of Monocacy. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so what will happen is that the 14th New Jersey is put in line to defend the other side of the river. And it will be in the thick of the fighting when it's attacked. And the position is called near the Thomas House. Actually, I do have that there. It's on the other side of the camp map.
There are some copies of the camp map
that don't have that. Okay, if you don't have the camp map, battle map, I get a volunteer to hand the, or who needs the battle Monocacy on the back? Okay. I have played with the common machine. My apologies on that. Like I said, I know the version of this. No, that's Winchester. Yeah. My apologies. Anybody else need one? There we go. Okay, on the map, you'll see up at the top where the town of Frederick is. It's marked as Frederick City. The Monocacy River is flowing north to south. The covered bridge, you see a marker over on the left with an arrow pointing to the river. That's what they were guarding in their first year in 62-63. During the battle, they're in the Thomas House, which is at the bottom part of the map. And they held their ground as best they could, but we did not win this battle. The Union Army was defeated and driven back to Washington, but The importance of it is they delayed the Confederate invasion for 2 days. And that was enough to get more troops back to Washington to defend the town, and Washington was not captured. But the Confederates came within sight of Washington during this third invasion of the North. Now, during the battle, Major Vredenburg was not with the troops. He was a trained lawyer. He was on a staff position. But he did come to see what was going on because he had been good friends with the Thomas family, which is the line where the 14th New Jersey was. So much so that when he had to go back to serve, or when the regiment got called up after Gettysburg, he left his dog named Dash with them. And so he's really friendly with them. He lets them take care of his puppy dog. He went to see how they were doing, and he also, even during the battle, checked to see that their silverware in the kitchen was all right and got that removed down to where they were hiding in the basement. The Thomas house still survives. It was recently added to the park, and I think you can go visit it there now. But the regiment held there as best they could, but they were overcome by sheer numbers. During the battle, the 14th New Jersey lost 140 men, more than any other unit in the battle, because of where they were at the southern end of the line. 40 members of the regiment were killed or mortally wounded. Sergeant William Cottrell was one of the regiment's color bearers. He stood in front of the regiment, waving his flag back and forth until a bullet struck the staff and then hit him in the chest. And his blood was stained on the flag, and there were a number of other casualties, like William Abel of Company I was wounded, went up to a hospital in Newark, and died in the hospital. I don't know what the recovery rate was for wounded. It doesn't seem to be real great. The only way they could really handle you, take the case of Stonewall Jackson, who was accidentally shot by his own men, Confederate general at the Battle of Chancellorsville. He got shot in the arm, but these are 2-ounce lead bullets. When they hit something like bone, they shatter the bone. You can't repair that. So their choice was give you some chloroform and saw your arm off. And Stonewall Jackson had his arm sawn off, was recovering, and then caught pneumonia and died. Okay. William Abel of Company I was wounded died at the battle, died on September 5th, 2 months after the battle. I'm going to give you a worst case scenario in a moment. Captain James Conover of Company D died in a hospital in Frederick a month after the battle, leaving behind his wife and 2 younger daughters. Lieutenant Colonel Caldwell Hall was badly wounded in the left forearm when a bullet hit his wrist and came out at the elbow. He had to resign not long later. So it's interesting to look at the case studies. I don't have time to go through them all, but I can't imagine being in battle and being shot at. Now, surely it's not. I just saw World War II in color with Tom Hanks last night about D-Day. I mean, the Germans are firing thousands of rounds a second at you, and your chances of getting through aren't good, but some did, thank goodness, and we carried the position. In the Revolutionary War, your muskets are only shooting 50 yards. That's why they line up shoulder to shoulder. They kind of shoot in that general direction. But muskets are not causing most of the casualties. Most of the casualties in a battle like Monmouth are caused by cannons shooting grape shot or canister. You don't want to attack a cannon. Civil War, their range is up to 200 yards, and it's still pretty deadly, but when you sit down and do the math of it, if there's, just doing some quick math, if there's 150,000 soldiers north and south at Gettysburg, each one's going into action with 40 rounds of ammunition, how much bullets is that? A lot. 150,000 times 40 is what? Million? 4 million? Okay, how many casualties were there? Yes, it was awful that there will be 30,000 casualties, but the number of casualties per bullet isn't really very high. But it's still, not to denigrate those who gave their lives to either musket balls or cannonballs, and as many will die of their wounds or die in hospitals as actually get killed in action. War is a nasty business. Not to say it isn't so now, but then at least it's not like Greek and Roman times where you're going at it with a sword and you can see the face of the guy you're fighting. War is a nasty business. So the 14th lost a lot of men, more than any other regiment at Monocacy. Almost all their officers were killed or wounded. After the battle, they didn't have a commander. They had a captain. Major Vredenburg had a cushy job on the staff, and he could have stayed there. But he said, no, my men need me, my friends need me, and he volunteered to come back to the regiment to command it later in 1864. Very noble work. His first battle as commander was at 3rd Winchester called Opequon. This will be on the colored handout. At 3rd Winchester, the Union Army, which is on the right, was attacking the Confederate Army. And the 14th New Jersey will be kind of in the middle of the map. I don't see, I have it marked, but it's going to be advancing up one of the roads. And what's interesting is, as it advanced, it was the center point of the attack. And the 14th New Jersey flag, which is the middle of the 14th New Jersey Regiment, will be the center line of the whole attack. And as such, received heavy Confederate artillery fire. Okay, Major Vredenburg was on his horse, leading his troops forward. What happens to officers who lead from the front? He turned around to say, follow me, boys. Got hit in the neck by a cannonball. Was dead before he hit the ground. So the reward for his heroism and patriotism was to get killed in the first battle that he led. The uniform he was wearing has been preserved by the family. It's now on display at Frederick, at the neat little museum there. And you've got it here on the handout. What amazes me is that his waist was a bit thinner than mine. Same thing when I looked at Stonewall Jackson's uniform with the shoulder torn off. They were thinner, but A, they didn't go to McDonald's as often as we do, and B, they were living a rigorous life in the camps. Everywhere they went, they marched, unless you're an officer. So the uniform he was wearing when he was killed is still around. It's on display. And even more interesting, if you flip the page over, there's another shot of Major Vredenburg, which is actually the view that I have that is authenticated. His horse survived and lived in like another 8 years and was sent back to Freehold. So his horse survived because he got hit in the neck. So we have his uniform in the museum, and to say his horse survived for a while. By the way, after battles, there were hundreds, yea, thousands of dead horses. Not so much at Monmouth here because we only had 20,000 people here, but there were dead horses all over the place. So that after Gettysburg or Bull Run, they just kind of dragged the horses into piles and burned them. They're too big to bury. You can't do much else with them. And I can't imagine, because my great-grandfather was in a Michigan battery. Each battery will have, well, at Monmouth they only had 2 cannons per battery. In Civil War they'll have 6. They have 100 horses. And they had to be fed and watered and taken care of all right. That's why you have farmer boys, like my great-grandfather, running the batteries, because you got to take care of the horses, because without the horses you can't pull the cannons anywhere. And the horses will stand there getting shot at. They'll get used to the noise, and if they're shot dead, you cut the harnesses off and go get a fresh one. And there's awful horse casualties in these wars. Anyway, I digress. After he was killed, his body was brought back here to Freehold. His father, Judge Peter Vredenburg Sr., was very sad as the family was. He was the hope for the family. And they buried him in the local cemetery off of Route 9. And a few years back, I used to run a memorial service for him on the anniversary of his death. What's interesting is he has a small gravestone, half the size of this podium. It gives his dates, but not as Army circus. And I often wonder why the family didn't do that. Maybe they had a grudge against the Army. A lot of the veterans, including my great-grandfather, the most significant thing they did in their life was to help defend the Union. And I like, especially I live in Hightstown, the old Presbyterian Cemetery in Cranberry. I'd like to walk through it and see the regiment numbers and imagine what battles these guys went through, because they put them up on their stones. Vredenburg didn't. Yes?
The cemetery on Craig Road and 3 is where that Trinity, is that where all the graves are? Or
From the Revolutionary Battle, you mean? Okay, digress, a good question. I will be giving a lecture later this year, I'll have to check my schedule, on the treatment of the casualties and the wounded. Most of the dead from the Battle of Monmouth at the Revolution time are on the field still. They didn't do like they did at Gettysburg, where they went, right after the battle, they were buried in graves that they knew who this guy was because of the Bible or something on him. They put a wooden marker up. Later that summer, the bodies were dug up and put in the Grand National Cemetery, which has a whole neat history to it there at Gettysburg, and then Lincoln came to give his famous speech. And they're still finding stray bodies here and there, but most of them were removed. The Confederate bodies were put into trenches, and in the early 1870s were removed mostly to Richmond in unmarked graves. The ones here at Monmouth, the soldiers were buried where they fell pretty much the day after the battle. One unfortunate regiment was given that job. Now, there were only about, and I say only, 300 soldiers killed at this battle. There were over 10,000 troops involved on each side. Each side lost 100 to 150. Some of those were killed outright or died of wounds and crawled into the woods, and bodies were found later, or died of heat exhaustion. Some died in the hospitals, and in this talk I cover all that. I said that the Craig House barn was probably used as a hospital, like every barn on the battlefield was. The main American hospital was an old tenant church, and actually one of the pews there still has the blood on it from the soldier that was treated there. And around 10 soldiers are buried under the plaza in front of Old Tenant with a marker. With the British, the lightly wounded, Americans were sent to Princeton, and some did die there. Some died here on the battlefield. The British badly wounded were left at the old courthouse on Main Street. And some of them died there and were buried in an empty lot across the street from where the Rita's Ice Cream is, if you know downtown Freehold. And how do we know that? Because somebody later built a house on the lot, and when they were expanding their basement, they found the bodies. So the bodies from the battlefield that died in the hospitals, and there's some at St. Peter's Church in town, were buried at the hospital site. But the other dead are on the battlefield still. And one of my projects is to try and figure out where these are. And we can go through the records, and if we know that, it's a little bit more complicated than this, but say the 4th New Jersey lost 8 men killed. I know where the 4th New Jersey fought. It's like if you study Gettysburg, the 20th Maine fought on Little Round Top. If they had 28 men killed, I'll bet you most of those were killed on Little Round Top. So you can track down where they're buried. But to answer your question, there may be some veterans buried there, but not battlefield casualties. Yes?
So in light of what you're talking about, can't the Historical Society or the green space kind of protect these fields? Or
well, they are, because they're in the park, and where the heaviest fighting was is now within the park. And we could go in with ground penetrating radar to try and figure out what's where. Now, we thought a few years back that we had found one of the burial pits, but it turned out to be a farmer's junkyard. There were horse and pig bones there, and it's just left over. But the bodies are still there somewhere. And what I want to do, and again, this isn't today's topic, but I hope you find it interesting, the railroad that was built through in 1852 from Freehold to Jamesburg goes right through the middle of the battlefield. That's not historic. In order to keep the railroad flat, they had to put a berm or a mound on it. And my theory is that they brought that dirt in to pile up the mound, which means that the ground under it is still undisturbed ground from the battle era. And I want to do, because that railroad's not used much anymore, do some archaeological work, because that's where some of the heavier fighting took place along that road as the battle flowed back and forth from east to west. I'm pretty sure there's troops buried under that railroad line. And someday we'll get around to looking at it. But I need some money in the project to do that. But they're there. One of my other goals, I'm getting a little long in the tooth and straying off the topic, but I am in between topics as we switch over to the 28th and 29th regiments, is to get a marker put out on the field in honor of the soldiers, both British and American, who died here. One problem is, we have a cannon in front of the building here, we have a statue of General von Steuben. If we put markers up on the north side of the battlefield, the two that were up there got stolen. They were bronze markers. And if we put a big marker up on Pine Hill where Molly Pitcher was, I fear for it. I'm sorry. Even the monuments at Gettysburg, the college students get rowdy and go out and throw paint at them and things like that. Someday maybe we get a marker out there to acknowledge them, but I am planning to put a marker here on the edge of the battlefield to honor them. At least we can keep an eye on it from here. So anyway, I digressed from your question. It was a good question.
Thank you.
Okay, so we were talking about the 14th New Jersey, which spent its 3 years, and some of them re-enlisted till the end of the war in the spring of '65. Major Vredenburg didn't make it. Okay, the 28th and 29th regiments that I mentioned were enlisted for 9 months. 9 months only. So they trained here, hopped on the train, went down to Washington, and spent their early days guarding Washington, which I guess is a pushy job, but it had really mighty fortifications there. They then went down to join the Army of the Potomac. The 29th New Jersey will fight a little bit at Chancellorsville. I'll have a booklet in the gift shop on them. What I want to look at is the 28th New Jersey, which was trained here. Specifically a soldier named Gilmore West, that I'll talk about in a little bit more. I often have given other years, and some of you might have heard it, a lecture on the 28th, focusing on his diary that survives. And it's neat to have the little entries every day on when he went and enlisted, how much money he was getting. On Sundays, they had to go to church twice. He got engaged to his girlfriend. He had a day's leave. They went to New York City to buy her a ring. And then he went off to war. And he says almost every day what he was doing, when his friends got sick, when his friends died, what the weather was like, when he wasn't feeling good. And then you get to the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862. The 28th New Jersey went across the river at Fredericksburg and helped occupy the town, which was in Confederate hands. The Confederates withdrew to a series of hills called Marie's Heights on the back. They pretty much went wild. I don't know how much the 28th was involved in this, but they robbed out all the houses. This is the first time there was street fighting in the war. They went in and stole the food and wrecked the paintings and burned what they could and made a mess of the place before they went into action the next day. Now, General Burnside, who was the Union commander, his plan had been to cross the river and go up and take the hills before the Confederates got there. But when he got down to Falmouth on the other side of the river, his bridges weren't there. They had portable big pontoon boats, flatboats, that they make bridge out of. So they had to wait for the pontoon boats to get there. By the time the pontoon boats got there, the Confederates were in the town and on the heights. He should have given up, right? No, they crossed the river, and in charge after charge, the troops got basically massacred, including the famous Irish Brigade. Okay, the 28th New Jersey will be in this attack. Gilmore West will be involved in the attack. Now I'll read to you some sections on this. As the New Jerseymen charged near the railroad, the enemy fire intensified. Some soldiers began to leave the ranks. The colonel rallied them, crying, "Onward to victory!" The regiment reached a series of board fences. A shell exploded near the face of Captain Joseph Crowell of Company I, taking off part of his nose. His replacement, Lieutenant Willett, took a bullet in the foot. Frank Oliver of Company D yelled, "Go get him!" and fell dead, got shot by a bullet. Private Gilmore West of Company I was hit by a cannonball in both his legs. We'll come back to him in a moment. Private Bogart stumbled, and the bayonet he had on his gun went through his own hand, because they're charging with their bayonet swords on. Company C, George Steele and Randolph Korsoff took bullets in the leg. Henry Giles was hit in the shoulder. A bullet, perhaps from one of his own men, smashed through the colonel's neck and came out his mouth. The colonel's leading from the front and got shot by one of his own men. Got hit in the back of the head, the bullet came out through his mouth. He tried to urge his troops on until gurgling in his own blood, he had to be carried off the field. The lieutenant colonel was wounded in the knee, but continued to lead the regiment, and they kept charging. The line of the 28th surged forward, and taking more casualties. The color sergeant was hit, and the flag went down. Sergeant Brandingham rushed up to grab the flag of the colors as he rose, a rebel cannonball, tore off his head. A few men got within 25 yards of the wall, but were shot down by the rebels. The rest fell back and lay down to protect themselves. They took a few pot shots at the rebels and then were through. Okay. The story of Gilmore West. He was shot. We have his diary, and it's interesting to read even up because we crossed the river today, we're ready for a battle now. He gets shot during the battle on December 13th in his legs. Lay on the battlefield for 2 days. Was taken off the battlefield to a hospital to have his legs amputated and died during the operation. Imagine the pain that worked.
Yeah, if you saw the saw out there.
Yeah. His diary, somebody else just put an entry in it. You know, this poor fellow died. And it's in a historical society, and I could cite more from it another year when I give that talk. So the 28th Regiment was heavily engaged here at Fredericksburg. The 29th will be engaged at Chancellorsville. They went into the war in August of '62. When is their 9 months up? September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April, May, June. Okay. In the summer of 1863, what's going on? Robert E. Lee is invading the North. The Battle of Gettysburg starts on July 1st. These 11 regiments of New Jersey troops, around 10,000 men, their enlistments were up a few days before Gettysburg. And they all went home except one. And I'm sorry, the one that stayed was not the 28th or 29th. It was sent up to Harrisburg because the men volunteered to stay a few extra days to help build defenses at Harrisburg. And unfortunately, Lee did not capture Harrisburg and the important railroad crossing there because his goal was to get to Philadelphia. But they were engaged at Gettysburg. So I don't want to say sad to say, the men of the 28th and 29th who had survived up to this point went home a few days before Gettysburg. And there's a monument to the 29th up at Fairview Cemetery in Red Bank. As I said, that the troops were raised here in central New Jersey, and we respect that, but they're basically farmers and mechanics, and not all of them came home. So before I summarize, we'll have Molly's been such a good girl, hasn't she? Molly dance. Molly dance. Good girl. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Molly. Okay, so that's our bit of Civil War history from here in Freehold. That there is a surviving Civil War training camp, Camp Vredenburg. I'm a teacher, so I need to summarize. And they always taught me the more times I repeat it, the better chance you have of remembering what I said. Named after Peter Vredenburg Sr., a local judge. The grounds of the camp from the summer of 1862 are still here on Monmouth Battlefield, and I located them, and you have a map of what it looked like. And every once in a while, I take a tour out there. There's not much left to see anymore, but it's there. And by the way, I didn't mention that They tried to raise another regiment here in 1864, but they could only raise one company, 1/10 of what they needed. So they sent the men down to Trenton. They took the barracks apart, put them on the railroad, sent them down to Trenton. And since then, it's been basically farmland until I found out where it was. So we had a training camp here, part of the park, and we do interpret the park that way. There's an exhibit out in front of the gift shop about Major Vredenburg and the camp. There's a display case or two with Civil War artifacts. There's a reproduction Union uniform and some of the artifacts that they found out on the site of the camp. The 3 regiments here, and I don't expect you to remember the numbers unless you had an ancestor in the unit. The 14th was a 3 years regiment. That's the one Major Vredenburg is in, the one that guarded the bridge at Frederick, and the soldiers died of various causes the year before, and then fought at Monocacy and Cold Harbor and came home, some of them after 3 years and some at the end of the war. The other 2 regiments are the 28th and 29th, which fought at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, and the worst casualty in my eyes, I don't know which is worse, the colonel that got shot in the back of his head by his own men, or poor Gilly West, who got shot in both legs and lay on the field for 2 days and died during the operation. They came home in June of 1863. Now, some of those guys will re-enlist later in the war, so I don't want to denigrate that, but that's what the rules were, and that's how they got more troops in for that part of the war. So that's the story of Camp Vredenburg and its Civil War units. I'll be glad to answer questions or other comments. Yes?
You mentioned about the railroad a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Could you give an idea of what the role of the railroad was in relation to the camp, given its proximity to each other? Was it used in a supply
Yes,
fashion?
definitely. Now, what's interesting is, good question, to look through the Freehold Democrat, which is the local newspaper, and when they were building the camp, and even when the camp was in operation, there were ads there for hay, straw, oats, military supplies. Now, clearly, that amount of supplies could be brought in from the local farmers, but they may be coming in from Trenton or wherever. How's it going to get here? By the railroad. And it's called the Freehold and Jamesburg Agricultural Railroad. And a major reason that campsite is there is because of the railroad, both for bringing in supplies and when the troops were ready to go, hop them on the railroad, send them down to Trenton, and then they need to take a train to Philly or a boat. But that the railroad's important to the history of the camp. I think it's still partly in use. I very seldom, I mean, the train tracks are obviously still there. They're still, because Freehold itself was a manufacturing busy town after the war. And that industrial district is here on the west side of town where the railroad is.
And I know that there are some rails that go through the borough, right by where Rita's is.
Yeah.
This is the same line we're talking about,
Yeah.
right? So I think some of it has been reconverted and preserved into rails for trails, something along those lines. And
I know
think it goes into
we've done that
Farmingdale.
with the Pemberton Railroad outside of Hightstown. Yeah, they make good walking trails if they're not being regularly used. Because of the question of who owns that right of way. And the line of ownership from those railroad companies that got bought up in the United States is a little hard to trace. But it is there, it is a layer of history on the battlefield. It's just bear in mind that railroad that goes right along 522 is not part of the battle because we weren't there then. Right. Yeah. Back, yes.
When the war first began, most of these units were Monmouth enlisted.
Okay, at the beginning of the war, especially New Jersey, Lincoln will call out troops, so many to each state. And in 1861, we raised 9 regiments for 2 or 3 years service. We also sent our militia down, and they were going in for 30, 60, or 90 days. So at the Battle of First Bull Run, there's a mixture. There's a regular New Jersey brigade with regiments going for 3 years, and the New Jersey Militia Brigade, which was in for 3 months. And because the term of enlistment of the New Jersey Militia Brigade was almost over, General McDowell didn't put him into the battle. He didn't trust him to fight. So it does get complicated. There's some troops going in for a year or 2 years, depending on the call out. But early in the war, there's that mix from anywhere from 30 days to 3 years. In 1862, when Camp Vredenburg was working, you're either enlisting for 3 years or 9 months. Given the choice, which would you take? Because you're getting a good bonus bounty for joining up. The draft started curiously after Gettysburg, and New Jersey, it's a complicated issue because if you got drafted, you could buy your way out by hiring a substitute or getting somebody else to go in your place. And some of the counties had to draw up draft lists of everybody between 18 and 40. My friend Joe Bilby recently passed away, did some studies of this, and technically no soldiers were drafted and went to the Army. Because sometimes if you were drafted and you lived in Hightstown, the town would buy your way out. You could exempt yourself by paying $100. And that's why it got to be called a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. You could either hire a substitute if you're drafted, or just pay a fee. That only exempted you for that round of the draft, the next round of the draft. So technically all of New Jersey's 80,000 troops who served were volunteers. But it's kind of like shotgun wedding in some cases, where you either volunteered and got your bounty, or you got drafted and got nothing. So does that answer your question well enough? Okay. Yes.
The general at Monocacy Junction, was that Lew Wallace by
Yeah.
chance?
Yeah.
The author of Ben-Hur?
Lew Wallace, who later wrote Ben-Hur, this was his claim to fame, was losing this battle. Now, as I mentioned in my account of the Battle of Monocacy, which is it's hard enough just to spell or pronounce, let alone people haven't really heard of it. It was a very makeshift army because it's full of Ohio militia, some stray cavalry units, and one division of good troops from the Army of the Potomac that included the 14th New Jersey. There weren't enough men to hold back Early's army. They knew that. But they're there almost as a sacrifice, and it worked. Early had to stop for a day, figure out what was going on, fight the battle on the 9th, and that slowed him down enough so that by the time he got within sight of Washington, enough Union troops had come up directly from Grant's army, which was down near Richmond, to defend the town. I don't think they could have taken it anyway. It's kind of like in an ancient history, or taught Latin in ancient history, that when Hannibal was winning all these battles in Italy, he couldn't take Rome because Rome had a wall around it. He could go up and yell at it and shoot arrows at it, but he couldn't take Rome because of the wall around it. Washington was the most fortified city in the Western world after the war started. And I don't think there was anybody who was going to take it anyway. But the sacrifice of the 14th of Monocacy helped slow them down so they thought they had a chance. And they might have actually tried, or heaven forbid, had they shot Lincoln, how would they work in a different thing. Okay, anything else? Okay, be glad to talk to you individually. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you.